The Dark Scrolls. The story of Mary Tudor begins in the great palace halls of late 15th century England, where the Tudor dynasty had only just carved its place upon the throne. Born in March 1496, she was the youngest surviving daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and her arrival carried with it the air of reconciliation and renewal. Through her veins mingled the blood of Lancaster and York, once bitter rivals whose wars had scarred the land. In her person, the fragile new dynasty found a symbol of unity, a promise of beauty and grace that would one day be offered to the stage of Europe. Mary grew up in the shadow of elder siblings whose destinies were already mapped. Arthur, the Prince of Wales, was the solemn hope of the dynasty. Henry, still a younger son, had not yet been crowned with the golden crown of kingship, but carried the vigor of ambition in his bones. Margaret was destined for Scotland, a pawn and bridge between two rival realms. Yet Mary was different. She possessed a rare quality that contemporaries never failed to remark upon, an almost luminous beauty, delicate but arresting, crowned with auburn hair and bright eyes that reflected both intelligence and vivacity. She was trained in the same humanist fashion as her siblings, educated in languages, music, and dancing, and courtiers whispered that she was the most enchanting of all Henry VII's children. Her childhood unfolded in a court still cautious from years of war, a world where every marriage contract was written not in the language of romance, but in that of treaties and power. From her earliest years, Mary understood that her life would not be her own. Alliances stretched across Europe, and her hand would one day be used to bind England to another realm. For now, she played among the gardens of Eltham and Richmond, learning to dance with the same poise that would one day charm the courts of Europe, while the court poets and ambassadors recorded her beauty as though it were a matter of state. When Henry VII died in 1509, and her brother Henry ascended the throne as Henry VIII, the world around her changed. The young king, only 17, embodied vigor and majesty. Mary, still in her early teens, found herself under the protective and, at times, possessive gaze of a brother who would become both her patron and her judge. Henry loved her deeply, yet his love was always bound with calculation. He knew she was his sister, but she was also a prize to be bartered in the chess game of dynastic ambition. Not long after Henry's accession, negotiations began for Mary's marriage. The suitors who appeared in the correspondence of ambassadors were not young princes of romance, but elderly monarchs, men who sought youth and fertility to secure their lines. Among them was Louis XII of France, a king twice her age, already ailing and desperate for an heir. The prospect chilled Mary, who longed for a match of the heart rather than a transaction of crowns. Yet the will of her brother and the needs of if the realm pressed against her desires. Before the French marriage, however, there was another undercurrent in her life. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. He was Henry VIII's closest companion, a man of bold charm, athletic prowess, and ambition cloaked beneath devotion. Mary and Charles had known each other at court, and their affection, though concealed, grew into something perilous. Both understood the danger. Henry would never easily forgive a union that robbed him of a political alliance. Yet the spark of attraction flickered, waiting for its moment. In 1514, Henry VIII arranged Mary's marriage to Louis XII. The French king, frail and desperate for legitimacy, saw in Mary both beauty and alliance, a way to anchor peace between England and France. The union was celebrated with pomp. The young princess sent across the channel, adorned in jewels, her face a mask of grace, concealing reluctance. She was only 18. Louis was 52. The court of France welcomed her, marveling at her beauty, whispering of her vitality beside their aging monarch. Yet within months, Louis was dead, worn down by ill health and perhaps by his desperate attempts to father an heir. Mary Tudor, now Queen of France, found herself a widow at 18. For a brief moment she tasted freedom, an extraordinary and rare state for a woman of royal birth. But her freedom was shadowed by fear. Henry would demand another marriage, another alliance, and she would once again be a pawn. In the quiet halls of mourning in France, she turned instead to the man she truly desired, Charles Brandon. With him, she saw the chance not merely of love but of seizing her destiny, an act of defiance that few princesses dared to dream. It was in this precarious moment that one of the most daring episodes of Tudor history unfolded. Charles Brandon, sent to escort Mary back to England, found himself caught in the whirl of her determination. She pressed him with her resolve. "Marry me now, before Henry can place me in another alliance." Brandon hesitated, knowing the wrath of his king and friend would be terrible, but Mary's insistence, coupled with their mutual affection, overpowered caution. In secret, in France, they married, an act of boldness that sent shockwaves through the Tudor court. When news reached Henry VIII, fury blazed. To his mind, they had committed a betrayal, not only of his authority as king, but of the dynastic strategy he carefully wove. Mary's defiance cut deep, and Brandon trembled before the anger of his sovereign. Yet Mary, with courage and guile, managed to soften her brother's rage. She pleaded, she wept, she invoked the bond of blood between them. Henry, whose temper could have destroyed them both, relented. He fined the couple heavily, stripped them of wealth, but he allowed the marriage to stand. Against all odds, Mary had secured her heart's desire. The princess had chosen love over power, yet in doing so, she had created a new branch of the dynasty, the Suffolk line. The years that followed were not the fairy tale of romance she may have dreamed. Life with Charles Brandon was rich in affection, yet also burdened with the weight of expectation. Together they had at least 4 children: Henry, Francis, Eleanor, and little Mary. Their household became a nexus of Tudor blood, a place where the next generation would be raised in the shadow of royal favour and suspicion alike. Their first son, Henry, carried the hopes of inheritance, but died young, extinguishing the promise of a male heir. Their daughter Mary also perished in childhood, leaving Francis and Eleanor to carry forward the line. Of these daughters, Frances would become the pivotal figure. Through her, Mary Tudor's bloodline flowed into the Grey family, and with it came a tragic legacy. Frances married Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and bore 3 daughters whose names would be etched in the sorrowful chapters of English history: Jane, Catherine, and Mary Grey. These granddaughters of Mary Tudor were drawn into the storm of succession that followed the tumult of Henry VIII's reign and the fragile settlements of Edward VI. Their fates, each distinct yet bound by blood, would transform Mary Tudor's legacy from one of beauty and defiance into one of sorrow and doom. But in these earlier years, Mary could not have foreseen such shadows. She lived at court, beloved by her brother despite their quarrels, admired for her grace, and often compared to Venus herself by poets and courtiers. Yet beneath the silks and jewels, she carried the knowledge that her choices had altered the course of her family's destiny. The Suffolk line, born of her bold marriage, was both a triumph of love and a seed of tragedy. By the mid-1520s, Mary's health began to wane. The brilliant beauty of her youth gave way to weariness, and the intrigues of court, Henry's marriages, the rise and fall of queens, the looming storm of religious division, pressed upon her. She withdrew more often to her estates, seeking quiet with her children, perhaps sensing that her story was nearing its end. In June 1533, at the age of only 37, Mary Tudor died, leaving behind a husband bereft and children who would carry the weight of her legacy. Her death passed almost quietly, overshadowed by the tempest of Henry's new marriage to Anne Boleyn and the break with Rome. Yet the echo of her life lingered, for while Mary Tudor herself had chosen love, her descendants would be thrust into the cruel machinery of ambition and succession. Frances Brandon's daughters would suffer imprisonment, execution, and humiliation, their lives offered as sacrifices upon the altar of politics. Through them, Mary Tudor earned a new and bitter title in the annals of history: the mother of succession's tragedies, the unwitting matriarch of biographical sorrow. The mystery that clings to Mary Tudor's story lies not only in her beauty or her daring marriage, but in the haunting irony of her legacy. She who defied power for love, she gave birth to a line that became the object of power's most merciless struggles. The courtly masks of joy and festivity that marked her youth concealed the threads of fate weaving toward tragedy, a reminder that in the Tudor world, no act of love or defiance could escape the grasp of politics. When Mary Tudor returned to England in 1515, the weight of secrecy still clung to her. She had married Charles Brandon without her brother's consent, a deed that, in the brutal arithmetic of kingship, was nothing less than treason. As her ship cut across the Channel, she must have wondered whether the love she had seized would be enough to withstand Henry VIII's wrath. The king had dispatched Brandon to bring her home, but she had forced his hand, turning the mission of escort into the bond of matrimony. Every mile closer to London was a mile closer to judgment. Henry VIII was not a man easily crossed. At 24, he was already known for his thunderous temper and his insistence on obedience. When the news reached him, his fury was volcanic. Charles Brandon, his childhood companion, his closest friend, had betrayed him. Mary, his beloved sister, had defied him. Courtiers trembled, certain that heads would roll, that the king would not forgive. Yet Mary possessed a weapon few dared to wield against Henry: the intimacy of blood, the tenderness of a brother who had doted on her since youth. She knelt before him, not as a subject, but as the sister who had once been cradled in the same royal nursery. She pleaded, reminding him of the affection he bore her, pressing upon him the sincerity of her love. For days the court held its breath. Then Henry relented. The couple would live, their union would stand, but at a cost. Heavy fines stripped Brandon of wealth. Their estates were pledged to the crown. Henry had been challenged, and he had to show strength. Yet beneath the penalty, there was forgiveness, born of blood and memory. Thus began Mary's new life as Duchess of Suffolk, wife to a man she had chosen, mother soon-to-be of children whose veins carried the mingled legacies of Tudor and Brandon. Their estates at Westhorpe and elsewhere became centres of noble life, filled with the bustle of servants, tutors, and retainers. Mary presided with elegance, her beauty still upraised, her manners compared to those of a queen. Yet she was no longer merely a princess of diplomacy. She was a matriarch, carving a sphere of influence in the shifting world of Tudor England. Her life with Charles Brandon was not free of shadows. He was loyal and affectionate, but he was also a man of appetite, ambitious, restless, at times reckless with money and with fidelity. Mary's marriage was one of passion and affection, but also of endurance. She had defied a king for this union. She could not afford to falter in it. Together they raised their children, Henry, who died young, Francis, who would carry the line forward, Eleanor, graceful and steadfast, and little Mary, taken before she could grow. The losses etched sorrow into Mary's heart, reminders that even in houses of splendor, death was a constant guest. Mary's place at court was complicated. As the king's sister, she held rank above nearly all noble women, yet her marriage to Brandon placed her outside the circle of queenship. She was both central and peripheral, close enough to witness the turmoil of Henry's reign, distant enough to remain untouched by its crown. Still, her presence was felt. Ambassadors wrote of her, courtiers sought her favor, and poets continued to extol her beauty. Yet beneath the glitter lay unease, for Mary's story was a reminder of defiance. She had once slipped the noose of dynastic arrangement, and such a memory could never be erased from Henry's mind. The years rolled forward, and with them came storms. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's queen and Mary's sister-in-law, fell from favor when she could not bear a surviving son. Mary, who had known Catherine since youth, stood by her at first, sharing the bond of queen's daughters, the sisterhood of women caught in dynastic snares. Yet as Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn grew, the court divided. Mary, ever loyal to her own blood, leaned toward her brother, but her sympathy for Catherine lingered. She had herself once been forced into a marriage she did not want. She knew the bitter taste of being pawned. Perhaps she saw in Catherine a reflection of her own stolen youth, though the fates of the two women diverged sharply. The rise of Anne Boleyn unsettled her deeply. Mary Tudor despised Anne, calling her, according to reports, the scandal of Christendom. To Mary, Anne was not only a threat to Catherine, but also a disruption of the sacred order. Mary's disdain was so sharp that she absented herself from court, retreating more often to her estates, preferring the peace of Westhorpe to the intrigues of Whitehall. She had lived long enough to know the peril of Henry's passions, and she chose not to embroil herself in the dangerous orbit of Anne's rise. Still, her bond with her brother never entirely broke. Henry loved Mary as the last true companion of his youth, the sister who had danced with him in the first golden years of his reign. When they met, there was affection, laughter, even tenderness. Yet Mary, now hardened by loss and maturity, spoke her mind more freely than most dared. She would rebuke him, tease him, even chide him in ways that left courtiers astonished. Only Mary could speak thus to Henry without losing her head. Only Mary reminded him of a time before the crown had made him a tyrant. As her children grew, Mary watched with a mother's anxious heart. Frances, her eldest surviving daughter, was a bright star, ambitious, and destined for marriage that would intertwine her fate with dynastic politics. Eleanor, gentler, would find a place of dignity in noble circles. Mary knew that her daughters' futures would not be their own, just as hers had not been. She counseled them, warned them, perhaps prayed that they would never be consumed by the crown's hunger. But destiny, relentless, had already marked them. By the late 1520s, Mary's health began to wane. The vigor of her youth ebbed, her radiant beauty dimmed into fragility. The brilliance that had once captivated Europe gave way to weariness, as though her body carried the weight of both her own choices and the burdens of her blood. She withdrew increasingly from the court, preferring the quiet of Suffolk, where gardens bloomed and halls echoed with the laughter of her daughters. Yet even in retreat, she could not escape the tremors of history. Henry's break with Rome shook the realm. The monasteries fell. The air itself seemed charged with division. Mary, devout at heart, must have wondered what England was becoming, whether the kingdom of her father was dissolving into something strange and perilous. Her last years were marked by reflection, by the bittersweet knowledge that she had lived a life both extraordinary and tragic. She had known the splendor of being Queen of France, the ecstasy of marrying for love, the pain of burying children, the exhaustion of watching her brother transform from golden prince to imperious tyrant. She had seen queens rise and fall, Catherine of Aragon cast aside, Anne Boleyn enthroned. She had watched England itself fracture along lines of faith and power. And in the faces of her daughters, she glimpsed the future, uncertain and fraught. Did she sense that Francis's children would one day be thrust into the furnace of succession? Did she dream, in restless nights at Westhorpe, of granddaughters whose names would be written in blood? In June 1533, at the age of 37, Mary Tudor's life came to its end. She died quietly, away from the roaring court, leaving behind a husband who grieved her, children who would carry her legacy, and a kingdom too consumed with the tempest of Henry's new marriage to Anne Boleyn to fully mark her passing. She was buried at Bury St. Edmunds, later moved to St. Mary's Church. No grand monument rose above her grave. No chorus of Europe's courts mourned her with pomp. Yet in the silence of that resting place lay a woman who had once been at the heart of kingdoms, whose choices had altered the very map of England's future. Mary Tudor did not live to see the tragedies that her descendants would endure. She did not witness Jane Grey's reluctant coronation, Catherine Grey's imprisonment, Mary Grey's isolation. But she was their beginning, the spark from which their fates were lit. In her decision to marry for love, she had sown both joy and sorrow. The courtly masks of her youth concealed the threads of destiny, woven tighter with each passing year. She had been a princess, a queen, a duchess, a sister, a mother. And in all these roles, she remained a Tudor, luminous, defiant, and forever bound to the inexorable pull of dynastic fate. When Mary Tudor was laid to rest in the summer of 1533, the bells tolled quietly, and the court scarcely paused. The king, her brother, was too absorbed in his tempestuous new marriage to Anne Boleyn, too entangled in the thunder of his break with Rome to mark her passing with grandeur. Yet, in the stillness of Bury St. Edmunds, where her body first lay, and later at St. Mary's Church in Suffolk, there was a silence heavy with meaning. The world may have moved swiftly past her, but the threads of her life were only beginning to bind themselves into the fabric of tragedy. Her husband, Charles Brandon, mourned her, yet he was a man who understood survival at court. Already he was turning his eyes toward securing his estates, ensuring the futures of the daughters who remained. Frances and Eleanor, now motherless, clung to him as the only pillar left. Yet for all his affection, the Duke of Suffolk could not replace the presence of Mary, whose grace had softened the rough edges of their household. Old, whose royal blood had been the shield against suspicion. Without her, the Suffolk family became more vulnerable, and the inheritance of Tudor blood more exposed to the ravenous appetite of politics. Mary's absence echoed most profoundly in the lives of her children. For Frances, the eldest, the loss of her mother was more than grief. It was the severing of her most vital protection. Mary had been a princess, the sister of the king, a figure who could always temper Henry VIII's wrath. Frances, though noble, did not carry the same shield. She would now step into adulthood under the eye of a father often distracted, a king unpredictable in his affections, and a court that measured every family by its utility in the game of power. The years after Mary's death saw Henry VIII's reign spiral into turbulence. Queens rose and fell. Anne Boleyn, whom Mary had despised, was crowned even as Mary lay in her grave, and within 3 years Anne herself would be beheaded. The king's household became a theater of blood and desire, where no one's place was secure. In this storm, Mary Tudor's daughters were left to navigate the perilous currents of alliance and favor. Frances, still in her teens, became a commodity to be bargained, her marriage a matter of strategy rather than choice. It was not long before her path was joined to Henry Grey, heir to the dukedom of Suffolk. The match bound the Brandon legacy to another ambitious house, creating a union that magnified both promise and danger. Through Frances, Mary Tudor's bloodline now reached into the Grey family, and with it the possibility, remote but undeniable, of a claim to the throne. Mary herself had never sought power. She had defied it for love. But her daughter could not escape it. The moment Frances took the Grey name, the destiny of Mary Tudor's descendants shifted irrevocably toward the heart of succession. In these years, Mary Tudor's shadow loomed. Though gone, she was not forgotten. Courtiers spoke of her beauty, daring, her defiance of kingship. To the daughters and granddaughters who would one day suffer, she became a kind of legend, the princess who had chosen love, the duchess who had lived and died on her own terms. Yet alongside admiration ran a darker current, the whisper that her defiance had planted seeds of unrest, that in breaking one chain she had forged another. For through Frances, the Tudor bloodline persisted in a branch that might one day rival the king's own heirs. When Henry VIII died in 1547, leaving the boy Edward VI upon the throne, the kingdom once more faced uncertainty. Edward was frail, his health fragile. Mary Tudor's grandchildren, Jane, Catherine, and Mary Grey, were still children then, playing in the halls of Bradgate, learning their lessons under stern tutors. Yet even in their games, destiny waited. They were great-granddaughters of Henry VII, cousins to Edward, Elizabeth, and Mary. Their veins carried legitimacy, and in a kingdom where succession was the most dangerous question of all, legitimacy was both blessing and curse. It was in this moment that Mary Tudor's presence, though she had been gone more than a decade, seemed to return. Her memory was invoked by those who traced lineage charts, by those who weighed claims. The Suffolk line, her line, stood as the alternative should Edward die without issue. And when whispers of religious faction entered the equation, the specter of her bloodline grew even more significant. For Jane Grey, the eldest granddaughter, was raised in the Protestant faith, her mind molded by reformist scholars. To those who feared the return of Catholicism under Edward's half-sisters, Jane appeared as a providential candidate.
And yet behind her stood not only her father, Henry Grey, but also the ghost of Mary Tudor, whose marriage had made this claim possible. Frances, Mary's daughter, bore the weight of this legacy with stern resolve. Her own childhood had been colored by the force of her mother's will, and she tried,
and to impress upon her children the same discipline. Stories whispered that she was harsh, even cruel to Jane, that she struck her, that she demanded obedience beyond endurance. Perhaps it was not mere cruelty, but desperation. Frances knew what it meant to be descended from a princess. She knew that every misstep could prove fatal, and perhaps she feared that the softness of youth would not withstand the furnace of politics. Jane Grey's brilliance, her command of languages and scriptures, her quiet strength, became the hope of her tutors and the weapon of her parents. Yet even as her star rose, Mary Tudor's shadow lengthened. For Jane's claim, however reluctant she herself might be, was not her own invention. It was the inheritance of Mary's choice decades earlier. If Mary had not married Charles Brandon, if Frances had not been born, there would have been no Grey sisters with Tudor blood to trouble the line of succession. Mary had once seized her life for herself. Now her descendants would, where trapped in a destiny they had not chosen. As Edward VI sickened in the summer of 1553, all eyes turned to the succession. Mary, the king's Catholic half-sister, stood next in line, but to many Protestants, her accession spelled doom. And so, conspirators turned to Jane Grey, the quiet girl at Bradgate, the child of Francis Brandon, the granddaughter of Mary Tudor. They clothed her in robes of destiny, pressed a crown upon her head, and for 9 days she was queen. Yet Jane never sought it. She wept, she resisted, but her blood bound her to the throne. And when Mary Tudor's namesake, Queen Mary I, swept into London, Jane's fate was sealed. The axe fell in February 1554, and with it, the first true tragedy of Mary Tudor's legacy came to pass. For Frances, watching her daughter led to the scaffold, the grief must have been unbearable. In that moment, did she think of her own mother, Mary Tudor, and the path that had led them here? Did she wonder whether the defiance that once seemed a triumph of love had instead cursed their line? Jane's blood stained the snow of Tower Green, and through it Mary Tudor's name was forever linked with the sorrow of queenship denied. The tragedies did not end there. Catherine Grey, the second granddaughter, followed her heart into a secret marriage with Edward Seymour, producing sons who carried Tudor blood, but drawing down the wrath of Queen Elizabeth I. Imprisoned until her death, Catherine's love became her chain. Mary Grey, the youngest, frail and deformed, also married without permission, and found herself condemned to house arrest, living her days in isolation. All 3 sisters, descended from Mary Tudor, paid the price of blood. Thus the diadem of sorrow settled upon Mary Tudor's memory. She had been the princess who chose love, the duchess who lived briefly in joy, the sister who dared rebuke a king. But in death, she became the unwitting matriarch of misfortune. Her descendants were not allowed to live quietly. They were drawn, led to the center of succession disputes, sacrificed upon the altar of ambition. In this cruel irony lies the essence of her legacy, that the woman who defied power for her own heart gave birth to generations destroyed by power they never sought. And yet, perhaps there was more. Perhaps in her daughters and granddaughters, Mary Tudor's defiance lived on, not only in tragedy but in resilience. Jane's quiet strength, Catherine's determination to love, Mary Grey's stubborn will. All bore echoes of the princess who once defied her king to marry for love. The price they paid was terrible, but their names endure, carved into history beside their grandmothers. Together they form a lineage both luminous and cursed, a story that binds love and power, choice and destiny into one inescapable thread. Even centuries later, when visitors step into St. Mary's Church in Bury St. Edmunds and see the modest tomb of Mary Tudor, they cannot help but feel the weight of what followed. She lies not among the world's great kings, not beneath a canopy of gold, but in quiet Suffolk soil. Yet from that quiet grave sprang a line that shook the crown itself. The whispers of her story linger in the stone walls, in the silence of the churchyard, in the memory of England's most tragic queenship. Mary Tudor is gone, but her shadow still moves, long and unbroken, across the generations that came after. In the years that followed the execution of Jane Grey in 1554, the ghost of Mary Tudor seemed to hover more tangibly than ever over the English crown. She had been gone for over 2 decades, yet her name and blood returned again and again to the forefront of events. When Jane was led to the scaffold at the Tower of London, the crowd whispered of her youth, her innocence, and her descent from the sister of Henry VIII. The axe that fell upon Jane was not merely the end of a young girl. It was the severing of a line that began with Mary Tudor's defiant choice to marry for love. The people knew it, the chroniclers recorded it, and the shadow of the Duchess of Suffolk grew larger in absence than it had in life. Frances Brandon, the surviving daughter of Mary Tudor, was still alive to bear witness to the downfall of her child. Her grief was immeasurable, yet she remained outwardly stoic, perhaps hardened by the lessons she had inherited from her mother. Never show weakness. Never forget the weight of blood. Some sources portray Frances as severe, a mother who pushed her children with iron discipline. But one must wonder if, in the silence of her chambers, she remembered her own mother's gentleness. Mary Tudor had once stood as protector, shield, and defier of kings. Frances, without such protection, became the instrument through which the legacy of Tudor blood was simultaneously elevated and destroyed. Catherine Grey's turn came next, though her tragedy was slower and more suffocating. She had fallen in love with Edward Seymour, grandson of the great protector of Edward VI, and in a rare act of courage, married him in secret. To ordinary eyes, this might have been a tale of romance, but to Elizabeth I, now queen after Mary I's death, it was a political crime. Catherine's sons, born of that union, carried Tudor blood in abundance, and in them, Elizabeth saw a threat to her throne. Catherine was imprisoned, her health broken by confinement, her love story ending not with a cry, but with a lonely death in captivity. The shadow of Mary Tudor lingered here too. Catherine had inherited her grandmother's will to love in defiance of politics. Yet unlike Mary, she had not been forgiven. The youngest, Mary Grey, bore perhaps the cruelest fate. Diminutive in stature, marked by deformity, she was often overlooked, dismissed as no danger. Yet when she married without the Queen's permission, Elizabeth's wrath fell on her as well. Though her confinement was less harsh, she too lived much of her life in restriction, the air of freedom denied. She carried her grandmother's name, Mary, but bore it as a burden rather than a blessing. It was as though the spirit of the first Mary Tudor hovered over her, reminding her that in their bloodline, even the most inconsequential act of love could summon the suspicion of monarchs. Thus the daughters and granddaughters of Mary Tudor became unwilling mirrors of her own story. She had married for love, defying her brother, but she had survived, forgiven by Henry VIII. Her granddaughters, too, chose for love, but they were not spared. Instead, they perished, imprisoned, or languished in obscurity. History seemed to play out her story again and again, but with crueler endings. Mary Tudor's ghost, in this sense, was not simply a memory, but a pattern, a recurring motif in the endless tragedy of Tudor succession. When Queen Mary I, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, ruled from 1553 to 1558, the contrast between the two Marys, the sister and the daughter, became striking. Mary Tudor, Duchess of Suffolk, had chosen passion and withdrawn from politics. She became the mother of tragedies by blood, not by will. Mary I, in contrast, chose politics above all, determined to reassert the Catholic faith and secure her crown. Where Mary Tudor had been celebrated for beauty, grace, and defiance, softened by charm, Mary I was feared for sternness, her name forever bound to fires and executions. Yet the two women, so different in path, shared one thing. Both were shaped, constrained, and ultimately defined by the brutal machinery of Tudor power. The one sought escape, the other sought control, but both were caught in webs spun long before their birth. Elizabeth I, who succeeded Mary I in 1558, cast yet another kind of reflection upon Mary Tudor's memory. The Virgin Queen, brilliant and formidable, chose never to marry, perhaps having learned too deeply the dangers of love entangled with crowns. Elizabeth looked upon her grey cousins with suspicion, knowing full well that their claim to Tudor blood threatened her own precarious legitimacy. To her, Mary Tudor's defiance decades earlier was not an act of romance but a ticking bomb. In Elizabeth's reign, the Suffolk line became synonymous with treason, even when the individuals themselves did little to warrant it. The Grey sisters lived and died in Elizabeth's shadow, their grandmother's choice transmuted into chains. This is how Mary Tudor became a ghost in history, not remembered with monuments or chronicles of grandeur, but as a haunting presence in the fate of others. Her defiance was romantic, almost fairy tale in its own moment, but its echo produced only sorrow for those who came after. Every time a Grey was imprisoned, every time Elizabeth scrutinized the line of succession, every time chroniclers recounted Jane's death, Mary Tudor's name surfaced. She was the origin, the mother of tragedies, the unintentional architect of suffering. Yet even in this spectral role, she remained distinct from the other great Tudor women. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and the other queens of Henry VIII are remembered for their marriages, their crowns, their children, or their lack of them. Mary I and Elizabeth I are remembered for ruling, for faith, for empire. But Mary Tudor, sister and duchess, exists almost in the margins, too important to forget, too dangerous to celebrate. Her story is not one of power gained, but of love taken, and for this, she lives on as a reminder that even acts of passion can reshape dynasties. In the centuries that followed, historians and poets alike returned to her with fascination. They spoke of her beauty, her daring, her boldness in marrying Brandon. Some painted her as a heroine of romance, the Tudor princess who seized happiness. Others painted her as a woman who doomed her descendants, whose one act of selfishness planted seeds of sorrow. In both versions, she is a ghost, a figure invoked to explain what followed, to haunt the tragedies of her line. The irony is sharp. Henry VIII's other sisters, Margaret of Scotland and his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, each played roles of open political consequence. Margaret's descendants would one day inherit the crown of England itself through James VI of Scotland. Mary I reigned in her own right. Elizabeth I reigned for decades. But Mary Tudor, though she wore the French crown briefly, is remembered less for ruling than for the chain of grief that her children and grandchildren endured. She is the ghost not only of the Tudors, but of the fragility of love within power. And yet, perhaps her ghost is not entirely mournful. For within the tragedies of the Grey sisters, there is also a stubborn dignity. Jane's faith, unbroken on the scaffold. Catherine's quiet defiance in love. Mary Grey's resilience despite frailty. All of these echo the spirit of their grandmother. If Mary Tudor was a ghost, she was also a spark, a flicker of human will that endured even when crushed by crowns. The dynasties may have used her blood, condemned her descendants, erased her monuments, but they could not extinguish the memory of a woman who dared to choose. As the Elizabethan age gave way to the Stuarts, Mary Tudor's name lingered less in politics but more in chronicles. Genealogists traced the Suffolk line, historians debated her role, and poets romanticized her beauty. But even then, her memory was entwined with shadow. She is rarely evoked without mention. Report of Jane Grey, rarely celebrated without recalling the deaths of her grandchildren. This is how ghosts survive. Not in monuments, but in echoes, in the way every story of one generation recalls the face of another. So Mary Tudor, Duchess of Suffolk, became a figure caught between romance and tragedy. To her brother Henry she had been the beloved sister, forgiven for her audacity. To her husband Charles Brandon she was love and partner, gone too soon. To her children she was the absent presence, remembered in grief. To her grandchildren she was the origin of their claim, the cause of their suffering. To later queens she was a reminder of danger, a warning in blood. And to history she remains the ghost of the Tudors, not ruling, not conquering, but haunting, forever suspended between defiance and doom. By the time the Tudor dynasty drew to its close at the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, Mary Tudor had been dead for 70 years. Her body lay in quiet Suffolk soil, far from the splendor of Westminster. But her name had not vanished. Instead, her legacy resurfaced in the lineage of her sister Margaret of Scotland, whose great-grandson, James VI, ascended the English throne as James VI I. Thus, the crown of England passed not through Mary Tudor's line, but through Margaret's. And yet, even in this triumph of the Stewart claim, whispers of Mary Tudor remained. For her descendants, the Greys, had been extinguished in sorrow, their blood spilled or confined, their hopes erased. It was as though the two Tudor sisters, Mary and Margaret, had embodied opposite destinies. One line perished in tragedy, the other rose to unite kingdoms. To contemporaries, this contrast was both striking and haunting. Mary Tudor's choice to marry Charles Brandon had produced heirs who were close enough to the throne to become threats, but not close enough to secure it. Margaret Tudor's choice, by contrast, had produced a line that seemed distant and irrelevant, until the sudden extinction of the Tudors made the Stuarts inevitable. The lesson was cruelly simple. Love had led Mary's descendants into disaster. Politics had lifted Margaret's into triumph. But neither sister could have foreseen how the centuries would shape their stories. As James I established his reign, genealogists and chroniclers looked backward, piecing together the tangled web of succession. They wrote of Mary Tudor not with the grandeur reserved for queens regnant, but with fascination for the sorrow that had followed her. She became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how one defiance, one act of passion, could ripple outward through generations. Her name appeared not as a central chapter, but as a hinge, the pivot upon which the great tragedies turned. In the 17th century, as memory of the Tudors transformed into legend, poets and playwrights began to romanticize her. Mary Tudor was painted as the golden princess of Henry VII, the beauty of the English court, the reluctant bride of France, the daring duchess who married for love. Her story, stripped of its political thorns, became almost fairy tale, the young widow who seized her own destiny. Yet always, beneath the romance, lurked the spectre of her grandchildren's blood. Readers could not forget that Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, had walked to the scaffold because of the line Mary had created. Thus, her image hovered between romance and tragedy, never fully free of either. In comparison with Mary I and Elizabeth I, the shadow of Mary Tudor seemed softer, more ambiguous. Mary I was remembered as Bloody Mary, her reign scarred by burnings and failure. Elizabeth was celebrated as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen who secured England's place on the European stage. Between these towering figures, Mary Tudor might have been forgotten, but instead she persisted. Page. Precisely because her story was unfinished in its own way. She had not reigned, she had not conquered, but she had shaped destiny through the hidden power of blood. In dynastic Europe, this invisible influence was often as potent as crowns. Historians of later centuries often remarked on the irony of her legacy. She had risked everything for love, and she had been forgiven. Her life, compared to the lives of her nieces and daughters-in-law, seemed almost fortunate. She did not die in disgrace. She was not executed. She was not imprisoned. Yet her descendants bore all the suffering she had escaped. Was this a curse, or was it the unavoidable logic of Tudor blood? In Mary's story, scholars found a parable of dynastic fate. Even when one woman defied power for her heart, power claimed vengeance through her heirs. In literature, she appeared in fleeting yet poignant forms. Ballads of Jane Grey almost always recalled her grandmother, Mary Tudor, reminding audiences that the young queen's tragedy was not isolated, but rooted in an earlier defiance. Some writers, seeking to soften Jane's death, elevated Mary Tudor as a figure of romance, as if to say that even in a world of tyranny, love could exist, even if it was doomed to bring sorrow. Others, sterner in judgment, saw Mary as selfish, accusing her of placing her own desires above the needs of England. Thus, even long after her death, she was debated, not for what she had done as queen, but for what she had chosen as woman. Meanwhile, the Stuarts, ruling England after 1603, carried in their veins the blood of Margaret Tudor. The contrast was constantly invoked. Margaret, political and dutiful, had ensured a crown for her descendants. Mary, romantic and rebellious, had ensured only grief. In sermons, in chronicles, in whispered gossip at court, the lesson was repeated. To choose love over politics was to endanger not only oneself, but one's entire line. Mary Tudor's ghost became not only personal but instructive, a moral Shah, Tao cast across dynastic history. And yet, within this condemnation lay admiration. For in an age when royal women were pawns, Mary Tudor had seized her own destiny. Unlike her sister Margaret, unlike her nieces, unlike so many others, she had insisted on love. The very audacity of her act gave her a strange immortality. People remembered her not as Queen of France, not as Duchess of Suffolk, but as the princess who dared. And this memory, tinged with both envy and horror, endured through the centuries. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as Romanticism colored the way history was written, Mary Tudor's image shifted once again. Painters and poets embraced her as a heroine of passion. Canvases showed her as a radiant young bride, her auburn hair glowing, her eyes filled with longing. Writers spoke of her as a woman ahead of her time, a Tudor who dared to live for herself. The tragedies of Jane Grey and her sisters were woven into the story, not as condemnations but as dramatic proof of destiny's cruelty. Mary's ghost became almost operatic, haunting but beautiful, a reminder that love and sorrow are inseparable in the pages of history. In modern times, historians have returned to her with renewed interest. No longer overshadowed entirely by her brother or her nieces, she is studied as a figure who shaped the succession more than most queens ever did. Her marriage to Charles Brandon is recognized as one of the pivotal decisions of the 16th century, not merely for romance, but for the chain of events it unleashed. Her daughters and granddaughters are seen not simply as victims, but as continuations of her defiance, each paying in their own way the price of her choice. Thus, Mary Tudor lives on in three forms. To the romantic imagination, she is the golden princess who loved against all odds. To dynastic history, she is the matriarch of tragedies, the mother whose bloodline suffered the axe and the prison cell. To political reflection, she is the warning. At one act of passion can change kingdoms. Together, these images form the ghost she has become, never reigning, never ruling, but always haunting. Even now, when visitors step into St. Mary's Church in Bury St. Edmunds, where her tomb rests, they find no grand effigy. She lies beneath modest stone, her name carved simply, without pomp. Yet for those who know the story, the silence is deafening. From this quiet grave emerged the 9 Days Queen, the imprisoned sisters, the dynastic crises of mid-Tudor England. From this grave came debates that echoed across centuries, and in this silence, Mary Tudor whispers still, reminding all who listen that the smallest defiance, the quietest choice, can shape history in ways no crown ever could. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.